Jimmy's parents died decades ago. I'm not far behind in myself. That's why I'm writing this out, I guess. I want to find some kind of closure, some solace before I get so old I'm shoved in a home by my kids for the rest of my days. Truth be told, I haven't spoken to either of them in years. Not for reasons related to what I'm about to tell you, mind you. I'm not so old that I can't look after myself, but I'm getting there. I'm old enough that most of the people I knew are gone. That in itself is enough to drive a man to turn to strangers on the web when he needs an ear. Anyway, Jimmy's gone too, as you can probably guess. He's been gone a lot longer than everyone else though. I can remember the day like it was the present. Even the tiniest details are etched deeper into my mind's eye than the most fathomless ocean trenches. It's pretty much the only memory from that time I can still picture clearly when I want to, not that I ever do. Fields of golden corn slow danced on an Iowa summer breeze. The air was sodden with pollen and adolescent adventure, humid even by Hawkeye State standards. It was the transient time between middle school grades in which all children's worlds advanced and evolved. We walked down the dirt track. Mushroom clouds have dust erupting at our scuffing feet. Simon, Jimmy, and me. Friends for as many years as we had lived. This was another walk among many, on another day like any other. If we had known it would be the last hike our trio took, we would have marked the occasion with a little more ceremony. As it was, the funeral of our camaraderie was marked only by the passing of a damp cigarette end. This sacrifice to the gods of manhood was complemented by a stolen bottle of Templeton, one that I'd never get to drink, but was still reprimanded for upon my mother's discovery of it in my satchel. The reason our boots had found this particular stretch of dirt road loomed ahead. The closer we drew, the more I realized the baseless rumor I'd believed Jimmy fabricated was true. A steeple in the sea of shimmering corn husks. It imposed itself on the landscape in a shameably out of place. The protruding spike was medieval in origin, an intrusion of Gothic European architecture at once both unfamiliar and discomforting to my brick-and-mortar knowing eyes. Standing at a diameter no greater than that of a lighthouse, the cylinder of cut stone and bone-colored slabs stretched nearly 17 feet from the moist earth. As we closed in on our target, the assuring rays of sunlight fell behind the eclipsing presence of the alien masonry. This was when the first shiver ran down my spine. I should have listened to my instincts and turned around. Unfortunately, bravado makes even the wisest man act a fool. Jimmy walked Simon and me to a wooden door on the sun-blocked side of the silo. A soggy affair dampened by the rain despite us having had several drought-filled months. Jimmy stopped to check that we weren't chicken. Both Simon and I puffed out our chests so as sure and we weren't. Even though I'm sure inside Simon's stomach was turning itself in knots just the same as mine. Once he was satisfied our genetics contained no trace of poultry, Jimmy pushed the rickety entranceway. Ancient hinges creaked. Some receded as our trio stared into the room on the other side. Jimmy had said it was haunted and had informed us so with the casual coolness associated with the alpha males of beta male friendship groups. This suave indifference became lost as he fell back in line with his fear-stricken comrades. I can't remember who took the first step across the threshold. There were a few details of that day that have made me, but who placed the thought that sealed our fate is one of them. The worst nightmares I have heard about poor Jimmy over the years have been the ones where it was me. A shiver ran down my back starting at the base of my skull and shuddering down my spine until it reached my legs, tensing them ready to turn. Inside the ice-cold interior was one feature and one feature only. It was a second door. This is where the similarities to the entryway we had passed through stopped, however. I wish I didn't remember the second door. The broad red rectangle remains in the darkest corners of my psyche. There the memory waits for moments it can flash to the forefront of my thoughts. These moments are the cause of my hour-long fits of horror-filled screaming. The thing I've refused to seek help for all these years. It would believe me anyway. The door stood free of any wall or support. It wrecked in the desert of off-white sand. From inside the tower, it beckoned us towards it. The nauseating vice grip of its inhuman words on my young mind is something I wouldn't wish on even the most sadistic of men. It whispered to us not with sound, but with thoughts and suggestions, a pulling both physical and mental that wrapped us in its tendrils and yanked us closer. Wavering pink light from an unknown source glistened on the splintering crimson wood. The whispering doorway was coated in something so thinly that I almost didn't notice. I think I only did it because of the smell. It shot straight past the lungs and settled in the deepest marrow of my bones. A sweet scent dripping with undertones of erosive aniseed. Of course, the door had a handle, a cast iron lump that strong-armed my gaze into fixating on its cryptic design. The gut-turning pink glow shone brightly on the polished surface of the knob. Whoever had carved that door knob must have seen hell. I can't relate to you exactly what the designs etched, scraped, and sculpted onto its gleaming surface portrayed because I honestly didn't understand them. I still don't. In my darker moments, I have pored over my memories of those designs, sketched them out even, trying to find something meaning in them. A spiral of pictograms too complex for the Homo sapien mind to comprehend, unfilled across the metal hall. Symbols and writing carved in inch-deep chasms, each filling me with more guts-wrenching dread than the last. I couldn't look away though. The sound of sobbing from Simon and shallow breaths from Jimmy confirmed for me that they couldn't either. The inhabitants of the underworld on the cast iron abomination had us all ensnared. They fed off of our reluctant tension, growing in their maddening complexity with every trembling teenage step. The beings in the doorknob begged us to enter, promising those things I refuse to remember, for their depravity genuinely disgusts me. What disturbs me most, though, is that I do remember how I nearly caved. At that moment, part of me wanted those foul promises fulfilled, even though my young mind understood almost none of them. It could have been me. Jimmy was the one who cracked, though. I wish I could have stopped him. I was supposed to be his best friend after all, as much as we kept this fact a secret from Simon. It's a sad play of fate. Datai was as entranced by that mind-rendering sire and song as the trembling hand that wrapped firmly around the doorknob. The door didn't creak when it was opened. It made no sound whatsoever, disturbing not a single molecule in the atmosphere. Grains of dirty cream sand remained still as crematorium ashes. With one fluid non-motion, the shifting ruby surface was open. I know for a fact that it was Jimmy who took the first step this time. I know this because it was he and not myself or Simon that the demonic doorway slammed shut. I only caught a small glimpse of what lay on the other side. I can't tell you what I managed to see over Jimmy's shoulder, not because I've forgotten. Bringing that memory to my mind to relay it would destroy what mental wherewithal I have left. I can't allow myself to judge up the sounds of all those people screaming. The smell of rancid meat and abandoned gas stations whenever I make the mistake of reminiscing on it makes resisting cleaning my nose out with bleach genuinely difficult. Reliving those screaming trees made of flesh, those mountain-sized organic tripods stalking the horizon, those endless plains of dark red air that twitched and heaved underfoot would destroy me. I may be bad for an old folks' home, but that's 100 times better than an insane asylum. I also can't tell you how long Simon and I stood in horrified silence. I can't tell you because I don't know. In my mind, it felt like an eternity. Since Simon's hanged body was found in a tree only 5 hours after we left the city of my house, in reality, it couldn't have been longer than about 15 minutes. The abominations on the handle had disappeared, the handle itself melting in front of our panicked eyes. The leering bloodwood had prevented us from saving Jimmy. It is to my shame that what I had seen within made any hope of saving him impossible anyway. It needn't have bothered. No, I'm being harsh on myself. I was just a kid, an innocent kid. Exactly like Jimmy had been. Simon started wailing as soon as the door reopened. The only saving grace was that what I had seen on the other side was now gone. All it had left in its wake was a barren wasteland, a decaying plateau of rotting charcoal appendages and mountainous three-legged corpses on the horizon. Compared to what had occupied the space a quarter of an hour ago, the thousands of human bodies didn't faze me. By this point, my battered psyche didn't flinch at the sight of the decaying figures piled in a great pyramid in the distance. This monument to stagnation and cosmic futility stood taller than the largest of the now-dead tripods. Even from a distance, I could see the throne at its peak. Its occupants were thankfully masked by clouds and the limitations of my eyesight. I don't think I would still be here today if I had seen them up close. The tortured stumbling of the old man through the doorway saved me from having to look at that figure atop their corpse throne long. The moment his gnawed feet crossed the threshold, the door sealed itself. The bloodwood erupted into a green flame. The pink light died, leaving Simon and me alone in the shadowy cylinder with the man from the world beyond. I remember that he was unspeakably light as we dragged him to the warmth of the Iowan summer outside the tower. We gave him some of the Templeton. We didn't know what else to do. His charred form was haunting. He was thinner than any man should be able to be. Outlines of shrink-wrapped organs protrude from his abdomen with nauseating clarity. He slurped the foul liquid through lipless teeth, the stolen bottle clasped in long webbed claws. His translucent skin of impossible age was scarred with a patchwork of symbols, unholy brands reminiscent of the etchings in the doorknob. The seared lines and sagging flesh contorted and writhed as I watched. They moved and shifted across the decaying man's ghoulish limbs, scriptures written in otherworldly tongues that inspired only lunacy in the eyes of mortal beholders. A small part of me wishes that I could describe them to you in detail. I hate that this part of me exists. I used to draw them whilst I slept, you know. It's why my folks said I couldn't keep a diary when I was a teenager. I showed one of the therapists once. She disappeared about a week later. I'm glad they burnt the drawings. Long matted hair covered the old man's gnawed features. This is why I didn't realize the slavering wretch from the terror beyond the threshold was Jimmy until it looked me directly in the eyes. Sometimes I try to guess how long he must have been there. Not often, though. I don't like to ponder on the torture that a measurable time frame was filled with. The terror in the eyes I clearly recognized as Jimmy's was enough to let me know my mind could not withstand such things. I can still remember his rotting, lipless gums, the smell of decomposing flesh on the noxious breath that funneled down his yellow tongue. The creature that was once Jimmy stood to whisper one last piece of advice before sprinting off into the cornfield. It has never re-emerged. The papers into police incorrectly hypothesized that Simon had killed Jimmy and hidden his remains. Simon's subsequent hasty suicide was attributed to guilt. As the sole survivor, I was apprehended, and when this tale was retold, labeled as traumatized. I'm not proud of the fact that I never corrected them. Let's be honest. If I had pushed the matter, traumatized could have quickly turned into schizophrenic, and from there, guilty was only a few steps away. I may have had my world ended, but I didn't want to do all the crying and trying to piece together what had happened in prison. Besides, it was a surprise for none of you to know that I went looking for the tower and Jimmy several times over the years. Suffice it to say, I found neither again. So I went about my life. Now I'm here decades later, retelling the only story I've ever told, hoping a bunch of strangers on the web will listen. I'm hoping during this will bring me some kind of end to the nightmares. If I've only got a decade or two left in me, I'd like to be able to get at least one decent night's sleep before I go. The thing that keeps me up, the thing that makes me wake up half an hour after falling asleep every night like clockwork is what Jimmy whispered to me before he disappeared into the corn. I have been where you'll go when you die, and the man in charge is angry with us. For all of this, I was your normal college fright guy. I won't beat around the bush about it. I was an asshole, as for all my friends. That's why, when walking back to our hotel from the last spring break party we'd ever attended, we decided to break into a museum. It was our idea of a harmless prank. It wasn't some big science museum like the Smithsonian, you understand. This was a small two-story building, housing various artifacts of importance to the locals. It was a time capsule containing all the memories of when this beachside settlement was still known for the prized sea-based fisherman court, as opposed to the drunk partygoers. Our selfish plan, which I'm not at all proud of, was to go in, strip the wax figures in its exhibits down to the nude, then pose them in, compromising positions. We could barely contain our drunk giggling as we searched in the dark for an entranceway at the rear of the building. There were 4 of us, me, Larry, Ethan and Jeff. It didn't take long for one of us to jimmy the rusted lock on the back door and slip inside. At the time, I was glad the museum wasn't rigged with an alarm system. These days, I wish it had been. If it had, the 4 of us would have been apprehended before we started poking around the unlit exhibits. It was Jeff who found the storage room. Behind an imposing dire arm of some local men fighting off a large sea creature out on the ocean was a trapdoor. It was made of the same sun-bleached beechwood the rest of the ground floor was decked with. The dozen or so hinges on one side were small, almost hidden. The thin seam that ran between the hatch and the rest of the flooring bordered on invisible. If Jeff hadn't tripped on an errant harpoon Ethan had displaced, he might have never noticed it. As it was, the rest of us stopped when we heard his voice drift up from the floor. "Guys, there's a basement." Of course, we went down there. It took us all 5 minutes to repurpose a 19th century fisherman's knife into a trapdoor unedging tool. The 4 by 4 feet square of beechwood didn't have a handle that we could find or any keyhole to suggest we needed to search for keys. It swung open without Creako's protest. Almost like the forgotten and often ignored museum wanted us, for loud, brash, obnoxious spring breakers, to venture into its depths. Cell phone flashlights flared into life one by one as we each reached the cool air at the foot of the ladder. The windows kept the dusty ground floor bathed in moonlight, but the space below was pitch black. It was a landing of sorts, a square concrete space with no light fixtures that we could see. A quick scan with our 4 flashlights showed us the room's only feature almost instantly. A door on the opposite wall. The bold black font on the yellow plastic sign meant we didn't have to guess the room beyond purpose. Storage. Management only. We were 4 drunk frat boys on spring break. We're drunk frat boys who could already be booked for a string of offenses from vandalism to breaking and entering to being drunk and disorderly. What else were we supposed to see the words management only as other than a challenge? Jeff had discovered the hatch to the basement, but it was I who opened the door marked management only. Larry, Ethan, and Jeff were on tiptoes over my shoulder, whooping and hollowing excitedly as I delivered kick after kick to the locked door handle. The inebriated ruckus stopped the moment the wood around the lock splintered. The door swung inwards. A bony face leered down at me. I screamed, stumbling backward and falling flat on my ass. The other food was howling with laughter. I looked up, anger replacing the fear in my throat. The pallid teeth and empty sockets belonged to a human skeleton. One of the kind scholars in the olden days used to study anatomy. The grinning skull seemed to laugh along with my friends from its glass case as I pulled myself to my feet, swearing under my breath. "Very funny," I snapped as we walked past the silently beforing skeleton into the forbidden storage room. My friends continued chuckling as we made our way deeper into the inky blackness. However, the more we browsed, the management's only artifacts with the beams from our cell phones, the quieter their intoxicated tittering became. The Museum of Local History on the floor above had been unsettling, but it was the kind of uncanny valley unsettling you get. With badly crafted waxwork sculptures, bleak paintings of gray stormy seas, and painful-looking implements from history. The unsettling that comes from trespassing in the dark in a space never meant for viewing with the lights out. A normal kind of unsettling. The hidden exhibits revealed by the flashlights from our phones were a different kind of unsettling entirely. Larry noticed the first one. It was a painting. I'm no expert in art history, so I can't tell you from what area the art is furlonged to. From the clothing of the foaming mouth figures depicted, it couldn't have been painted more recently than at the turn of the 19th century. We gazed at it for a while, not saying much. The 8 men and women on the canvas had been painted so vividly that they looked more as though they'd been captured by shutter and lens than by oil and brush. That's what made the expressions on their faces so frightening. Each pair of eyes was bulging, protruding so far that veins and muscles were clearly visible where eyelids should have been. Their snarling lips peeled back tightly so that every crack and frothing crevice in the gums found their yellow teeth could be seen. Each snarling, ravenous face danced around a pile of flaming logs at the base of a wooden pole. A pole that had heard a crying child tied to the top, dangling mere feet from the flames. That wasn't what made the lump caught in my throat, though. Not initially, at least. No. Or first mate, I started to consider the possibility I was somewhere very wrong. It was the building the mad dancers were making their sacrifices in front of. It was our hotel. I won many times since refurbished, but still very much rustic and true to the town's roots hotel. The painting didn't have a title or a frame. It hung on a rusted nail and dirty string from the cinder block walls. After a few minutes, one of us shouldered and suggested we move on. Unfortunately, the rest of the exhibits only gave the growing tightness in my chest further cause to take hold. The lump in my throat grew heavier with each illuminated exhibit. The spaces between breaths were shorter and shorter with every new oddity the museum management kept hidden down here, away from minds too weak to comprehend them. There were taxidermied creatures none amongst us recognized. Stuffed things with forms completely unfamiliar. A menagerie of twisted beings with no tangible adherence to the laws of nature or biology. There was a school of 6 dried fish, each sporting 3 pairs of inch-long human arms, hung on wire from a thin pipe scaffold. There was what I can only describe as an orangutan with matted dark fur and a large mouth where that embellished me. Locked forever in a jewel with a rhino-sized dog and a wooden large plinth. Most shocking of all was the large dried-out husk of a bus-sized maggot with the face of a colossal human baby hanging from the ceiling by thick cables screwed into somewhere unseen on its back. We found dioramas and paintings of horrific acts and incidents. The details are so clear they could only have been recreated from the memory. There were shelves of dusty books, volumes bound in I don't know what to know what. Students with titles like Ha 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 the Children Are Bleeding, A Housewife's Tale and The Sanctity of Silence. Scattered on amongst the paintings, shells and grotesque anatomies would be glass cases containing tools and implements whose designs seemed far too intricate and advanced to carry the level of rust and corrosion they did. Despite the fresh wave of dread that came with every new monstrosity, we pressed on, trying and failing to convince each other and ourselves that none of them were real. It's just leftover stuff from some stupid art project. Look, you can see on that one it's obviously made of rubber, right? Whoever made this stuff was a really twisted guy, probably some kind of sick basement dweller. These comments and many more did nothing to stem the rising panic and what forced nervous last remained. We'd been stupidly traumatizing ourselves and the crushing darkness for about half an hour before it. A mask, laying alone on a plinth full 6 feet away from any other nightmarish exhibits. I spotted it first. I wish that hadn't been the case. If one of the others had been the first to unearth that in the dark with the glare of their cell phone lights, maybe they would have been the edit that put it on. It was completely blank, save for a half dozen or so angular symbols carved thumb-deep into its surface. There were no eyes, no mouth holes, no gaps with which the wearer could see or breathe. It was made of a metal I didn't recognize, a dark and bluish mottled substance that reflected the life of my phone back at me as a heady mix of purples, oranges and greens. Almost like an oil slick. It has the strangest qualities and is more difficult to put into words. I can't quite phrase it right, but I knew I was looking at it. It was happy. It had wanted to be found, in an awareness I can't explain. It said let me know that very clearly. It caught me, communicating with some conscious suggestions that this was the one time when you should touch the exhibit. I was already holding the thing in my hands before Larry or Jeff or Ethan yelled something in my direction through the haze. Even though the air this far into the mausoleum of unutterable things was freezing, the mask was warm to the touch. Its pearlescent metal surface soothed my fingertips, inviting me to feel its bliss-inducing heat on my face. I just about registered a hand on my shoulder when the mask's velvet interior suckled onto my waiting, smiling features. Instantly, I knew I'd hecked up. When my eyes opened, I wasn't in the storage room. I wasn't anywhere. I was floating in a void, surrounded by nothing but endless blackness. Not floating, falling. There was no air, but the emptiness ripped and skimmed my face as I plummeted. All around me was pitch black. Yet as I strained, I realized to my growing horror that there were shades and tones for that absolute nothingness, despite the fact it's utterly impossible. Streaks of the dark shadows still concealed monsters under children's beds. Patches of moonless nights with which unspeakable things prowl, ills of the unknowable darkness that sits in the hearts of evil man. All of these shades of nothing and more danced and writhed around me while I tumbled. The friction that shouldn't exist in a vacuum ripping my skin raw. I began falling in a soundless scream for what felt like days when something slammed into my chest, knocking the wind out of me. Thump. The smell of sea air and fish brown pierced my nostrils. I could hear men grunting and shouting from every direction, roaring to be heard over the waves. There was a solid floor beneath me, wood that was wet and cold and smelled of dead things pulled from the depths. I'd been in the multi-tone darkness so long that it took me a few moments to register that my vision was returning. I stood still screaming, my skin was still being whipped raw, but now the lashing came from freezing rain-filled Atlantic winds. I was on a ship, the same fishing vessel as the dire armor in the front of the trapdoor in the museum. The fishermen were there too. They were staring at me, each stopping whatever important task they were doing to go up at the sudden stranger in their mind, in their midst. I didn't have time to go, one of them yelled, pointing at something behind me. I turned. The screams were knocked from my horrified lungs by a fresh, inexpressible terror. The thick tentacle of the ocean monstrosity in the dire armor crashed through the rigging above my head. Splinters and shards peppered the rain as I fell to my knees, wailing at the sight of those sewer plates as stickers, lined with obviously human teeth. I was rooted, paralyzed with fear, as the squid-like appendage as thick as a train funnel fell upon me. I closed my eyes, the smell and warmth of its flesh inches away from my face. When I was falling again, the salty tang and roar of the waves were replaced with the sting of rushing darkness. Bum! The wind was once more knocked from me. This time I could smell smoke, hear a child crying. I was in the painting Larry had found. The warmth of the fire licked my tear-stained face as I backed slowly away from the rabid dancers leaping towards me. They were whooping and hollering, screaming in a dated but recognizable dialect about my coming being a sign from the old gods. One manages to grab my arm and bite down, leaving a scar I can still feel but can't yet bring myself to look at. I turned to run, bumping into a stolen old man clutching a canvas, brushes, and some paints. Thump. I stood in a field. A crowd of indigenous-looking people stopped skinning the headless orangutan they killed to stand and pointed in my direction, reaching for their spears and axes. Before they can split my skull open, there is a deafening rib bit. A frog the size of a rhinoceros leaps from the bushes. It lands on one of the natives. It's a loud crack in the wind as their spine breaks. Before either his kin or myself can react, I'm knocked to the ground by a sticky amphibious tongue with a tip the size of my face. I'm wrenched from the ground, my fingernails filled with dirt as I scramble to pull myself away from the beasts waiting more. Thump. I'm standing alone on a plain. Wild horses stampede around me, braying and snarling and panicking. I turn around to see they are being chased by a living version of the baby-faced maggot husk from the museum. Spindly arms that must have rotted off snatching up the whole horse to stuff into its gaping toothless mouth. Its glassy, lifeless eyes lock on mine, and somewhere in the back of my skull I feel its sudden curiosity at the new thing before it. Thump. High prehistoric reptiles scamper at my feet. They stopped building a waist-high obelisk and put down the miniature tools to observe me, conserving in a language of syllables and vowels impossible to replicate with the human tongue. Thump. Sulfur and ash clogged my lungs. I can hear nothing but the roar of primordial tectonic fury. The sky is dark and red. All my eyes are blinded by a layer of soot. I catch sight of a horizon of volcanoes and firestorms. Thump. I'm in space, and a spiraling cloud of dust and debris stretches around me. From somewhere in the distance, the faint light of our infant stars covered my choking full of faint light. Orange glow. I'm sitting in a chair. There's a glaring sun over me, although it is not my own. I wince from its brightness, straining to take in my surroundings. The chair is on a completely flat metal surface that glistens with the same pearlescent shimmer as the mask. This flat plane stretches around me in all directions until it reaches a large well of the same material, thousands of miles in the distance, and taller than any building the hands of men could construct. The bindings and chair are like nothing I recognize. They're at once both organic seeming and flexible, yet apparently forged from the same rigid metallic substance as the ground. I don't have long to try and understand this contradiction, however. The booming voice from the stairs beyond this little alien sun made sure of that. Add good. We'd wondered when your kind would be ready. The power of it knocked what little breath remained in my lungs. I felt my eardrums burst. That's how I know I can't hide in the false comfort of convincing myself this never happened. I could never have imagined or conceived the owner of that atom-rattling voice, and even if I could, a voice in my head couldn't leave me permanently deaf. The end of the first sentence was enough to make sure I'd never hear anything again. The rumbling and buzzing in my every fiber let me know it was still conversing as I looked up. It was bleeding and let out a scream I could no longer hear that I don't think stopped for several days. The alien sun wasn't a sun. It was a bulb. A planet-sized bulb hanging from the wires as thick as Jupiter's red spot in diameter. The flat metal plane I was on wasn't an empty landscape. It was a petri dish. The real horror came when I worked out the true meaning of the shifting constellations in the sky above. The stars beyond the colossal bulb above the dish weren't stars at all. They were reflections. Reflections in the trillions of eyes of the galaxy-sized being, peering down at my impossibly tiny, insignificant form. Its scale was so vast that I couldn't make out many details beyond these eyes. An insurmountable number of pupils the size of stars blinked and drilled into me from the gaping no longer emptiness of space above. Even craning my neck to look directly up, I couldn't see the full extent of its form. So colossal was this being that the twinkling reflections from the furthest of its eyes would have taken eons to reach the spots where I strained and fought against my bindings. The stellar gulfs between eyes were smoky and gaseous, yet I knew that beyond those plumes, large enough to swallow the Milky Way, a vast cosmic anatomy lay hidden. At the great rim of the dish on which I studied its form spread into a nexus of thin tendrils. These longitudinally impossible to measure swarms of ancient limbs, ballooned and stretched outwards, forming thick oily clouds that convulsed across the steel tundra. The rupturing bust from the beyond, all reason didn't stop as one of these fogs snaked towards me. Its tip was the size of a continent. I could feel the gravitational pull from it as it got closer, the sheer force threatening to rip me from the living metal chair. I was still screaming when my eyes rolled back in my skull. The experience was finally too much for my mind to take without shutting off. I was in the basement of the museum. Larry, Jeff, and Ethan were standing above me. They were shaking me, saying something. I couldn't hear them. I couldn't hear anything but a shrill ringing that drowned out all of the sounds. It didn't matter to me anyway. I ran both from the storage room and from then, but not before bending over to puke for a good 20 minutes. I was shaking, crying. Could feel via the tearing in my throat that my screaming hadn't stopped. I never saw any of them after that night. I cut off all ties, didn't even message them to explain why. They could have gotten curious and tried on the mask themselves for all I know. I ran straight back to the hotel, covered in tears, grabbed my bags and left, sinking everything I had into the first ticket back home. Not college home either, home. I dropped out of school and moved back in with my parents. I can't look at the photos of that time of my life, not without breaking down into a quivering mess. Even with heavy medication, the slightest reminder is enough for me to write off the rest of the day. Or at least it was. I've been getting better with sign language, so I've gained back a little confidence. Even enough to face writing down everything for the first time, to actually try to relive the memory and piece together what I saw. You probably wouldn't guess from the length, but this has taken me about 5 months to get down. I've had to stop multiple times, and once even had to check back into a psych unit for a few days. It's been worth it though, looking back. It's out of my system. That's the first step, right? Now I can go about the task of taking my therapist's advice and try to pretend it didn't happen. That's not her words for it, but they are mine. I know it's happened. This wasn't a drunken memory distorted by a psychotic break. I remember all of it far too clearly. Plus, if it's a false memory, why did a mask-shaped package wrapped tightly in a crumpled canvas painting of madmen dancing around a pyre arrive on my doorstep this morning?